What happened when a judge faced her childhood friend in court? The answer shocked the nation. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the familiar sounds of shuffling papers, quiet whispers, and distant gavels filled the air. Judge Madison Carter sat at the bench, her expression calm and professional, ready for another day of cases in Maplewood, Georgia. The bailiff's voice broke through the hum, announcing the next case, the state of Georgia versus Michael Grant. Madison straightened in her seat, her hands resting lightly on the polished oak bench, and glanced at the file before her. Assault, robbery, and resisting arrest. The charges were grim but all too common. A familiar ache settled in her chest as she prepared herself for another glimpse into the broken lives caught in the system. When the defendant entered, shackled at the wrists and ankles, Madison froze. The man standing before her wasn't a stranger. He was Michael Grant, her Michael, a childhood friend from long ago. Madison Carter's breath hitched as she stared at the man standing before her. Michael Grant. The name echoed in her mind as a flood of memories surged to the surface. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not now. The man in shackles, hunched and weathered, bore little resemblance to the boy she once knew, the boy who dared her to dream beyond the dusty streets of Maplewood, Georgia. Yet his eyes, shadowed by years of hardship, still held that familiar spark. Madison tightened her grip on the gavel, forcing her voice into its usual authoritative tone. "Mr. Grant, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" she asked, though the words felt distant, almost foreign, as they left her lips. Michael lifted his head, his gaze locking with hers for a fleeting moment before dropping to the floor. "Not guilty, Your Honor," he replied, his voice hoarse but resolute. A ripple of unease coursed through the courtroom. Spectators exchanged glances, sensing an unspoken tension. Madison fought to keep her composure, but her mind raced. How had their paths diverged so drastically? They had once spent countless afternoons beneath the shade of pecan trees, whispering dreams of escaping their small town and its unyielding expectations. Now he was an accused criminal, and she was the judge presiding over his fate. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named Marcus Reed, rose to deliver his opening statement, his tone clinical and detached. He painted Michael as a desperate man who had resorted to violence, citing eyewitness accounts and grainy surveillance footage that allegedly placed him at the scene of the crime. Madison listened intently, her face a mask of neutrality, but her heart sank with every damning word. When it was time for the defense, Michael's attorney, Dana Reeves, stepped forward. Young but fiercely determined, Dana's voice carried across the room as she dismantled the prosecution's narrative. "This case isn't as simple as it seems," she declared, pacing before the jury. "The evidence is circumstantial and the eyewitness accounts are inconsistent at best. My client maintains his innocence, and we intend to prove it." As the trial unfolded, Madison found herself scrutinizing every detail with a level of intensity that bordered on obsession. The surveillance video, though grainy, showed a figure in a dark hoodie, an image the prosecution claimed was Michael. But something about it didn't sit right. The movements were too abrupt, too disjointed, as if something had been tampered with. The tension in the room mounted as the first witness, a convenience store clerk, described the alleged assault. Under Dana's cross-examination, cracks began to show. The clerk admitted he hadn't clearly seen the attacker's face. "It was dark," he stammered. "He had the hood up." Madison's gaze flickered to Michael. He sat still, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, but his jaw clenched with every word. He refused to look at her, and she couldn't blame him. She had failed him once before, years ago when her father had forbidden her from seeing him. Now the weight of the past and the present bore down on her. Was Michael truly guilty, or was he another victim of a system too eager to condemn? And if she couldn't separate the truth from the shadows, what kind of justice could she deliver? The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with anticipation. Every eye was on Michael Grant as the prosecutor prepared to introduce the surveillance footage, the so-called smoking gun that could seal his fate. Madison Carter's pulse quickened as the video began to play on the screen. The grainy black and white footage showed a figure entering the convenience store, movements jerky and hurried, A scuffle ensued, followed by the figure lunging over the counter and grabbing at the register before darting out of view. "That's it?" Dana Reeves asked, rising from her seat with a deliberate calm that belied the tension in the room. "That's what you're basing your case on?" She turned to the jury, her gaze steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the footage. Can you say with absolute certainty that this is my client?" The prosecutor, Marcus Reed, smirked. "The jury can decide for themselves," he replied. "The figure matches Mr. Grant's description: height, build, clothing. And let's not forget, he was found near the scene with cash in his possession." Dana didn't flinch. "Was there a red hoodie recovered from my client?" she shot back. "No," Reed admitted, his smile faltering slightly. "But he could have discarded it." "Could have," Dana repeated, her tone biting. "That's not evidence. That's conjecture." The exchange sent murmurs rippling through the spectators. Madison's eyes darted to Michael. He sat rigid, his face unreadable, but she could sense the storm brewing beneath his stoic exterior. Her heart ached as she watched him endure the weight of accusations that felt as murky as the video playing on repeat. The defense's next move was bold. Dana called a forensic video analyst to the stand, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Based on my analysis," the expert began, "the footage is too low resolution to definitively identify anyone. Furthermore, the timestamps on the video appear to have been altered, which raises serious questions about its authenticity." Reed jumped to his feet, objecting furiously. "Speculation, Your Honor." "Sustained," Madison said, her voice firm though her mind churned with doubt. She couldn't ignore the implications of the altered timestamps. It was a crack in the prosecution's case, one that, if examined closely, could reshape everything. The tension ratcheted higher when Officer Daniel Harris, the arresting officer, took the stand. Dana pounced on his testimony. "Officer Harris, you arrested my client 2 blocks from the scene. Did you find him acting suspiciously?" Harris hesitated. "He matched the description." Dana's eyes narrowed. "A vague description. Did you find any stolen cash or a weapon on him?" Harris shifted uncomfortably. "He had cash." "How much?" Dana pressed. "A few bills. Nothing close to what was reported stolen," Harris admitted, his voice barely above a mumble. The courtroom erupted in murmurs again, and Madison banged her gavel to restore order. She couldn't suppress the growing unease. The more she heard, the more it became clear that this case wasn't just about Michael. It was about the cracks in a system that too often jumped to conclusions. As the trial adjourned for the day, Madison lingered at the bench, her mind a whirlwind. Michael's life hung in the balance, and so did her faith in the justice system she had sworn to uphold. Could she truly separate the past from the present? Or was this case destined to expose the painful truth she had spent her career trying to avoid? The courtroom was packed as the defense prepared to call its most critical witness, Michael Grant himself. The decision to have him testify was risky, but his attorney, Dana Reeves, knew it was their best shot at swaying the jury. The atmosphere crackled with tension as Michael stood, the chains on his wrists clinking faintly as he approached the stand. Madison Carter watched from the bench, her heart pounding. She wasn't just presiding over this trial. She was living it, feeling every twist and turn in her bones. Michael settled into the witness chair, his broad shoulders squared as he faced the jury. His eyes, steady but shadowed, seemed to search the room for something. Perhaps hope, perhaps understanding. Dana stepped forward, her voice firm but gentle. "Mr. Grant, can you tell us where you were on the night of the alleged robbery?" Michael took a deep breath, his voice low but steady. "I was walking home from my friend's house. I'd stopped by to check on him after hearing he wasn't feeling well." Dana nodded, stepping closer. "And during that walk, did you enter the convenience store where the robbery occurred?" "No," Michael replied firmly, his gaze locking with a juror in the front row. "I didn't even pass by it. I was 2 blocks away when the cops stopped me. They didn't ask questions. They just assumed I was guilty." The prosecutor, Marcus Reed, stood abruptly, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Mr. Grant, you expect us to believe you were simply walking home, minding your own business, and just happened to be stopped near the scene of a robbery?" Michael's jaw tightened, but he held his composure. Yes, that's exactly what happened. I had no reason to stop there. I didn't take anything from anyone. Reed smirked, pacing before the jury. And yet you were found with cash in your possession. How do you explain that? Michael straightened, his voice calm but unyielding. I'd been paid earlier that day for some yard work. The money was mine. Reed scoffed. Convenient, isn't it? Before Michael could respond, Dana interjected. Objection, the prosecutor is badgering the witness. Sustained, Madison said, her voice firm. Yet beneath her steady exterior, her mind churned. She couldn't shake the feeling that Michael's story rang true. He wasn't defensive or rehearsed. He was resolute, even vulnerable. Dana stepped forward again, addressing Michael. What do you want the jury to understand about you, Mr. Grant? Michael's voice softened, but it carried across the courtroom. I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes. But I'm not a violent man, and I didn't do this. I've spent my whole life being judged for things I didn't do. All I want is for someone to see me as more than what's on paper. A heavy silence fell over the room, the weight of his words pressing on everyone present. Madison gripped the gavel, her throat tight. This trial was no longer just about facts or evidence. It was about a man's humanity and the justice system's ability to see it. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak as the jury deliberated. Hours passed, but Madison Carter remained at her bench, her posture rigid, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Every word of testimony replayed in her head, the store clerk's uncertainty, the shaky surveillance footage, and Michael Grant's raw, heartfelt plea. This was no ordinary trial. It felt like a reckoning for both of them, a moment that would determine not just Michael's fate, but also the integrity of the justice system itself. Outside the courtroom, reporters milled about, their cameras flashing every time the heavy oak doors opened. Spectators whispered in clusters, speculating about the outcome. Inside, Michael sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly, his head bowed. His attorney, Dana Reeves, whispered something to him, but he barely reacted. The weight of the moment was written all over his face. When the jury finally returned, the room fell deathly silent. Madison straightened in her seat, her fingers brushing the gavel for reassurance. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a steely expression, rose, holding the verdict in trembling hands. In the case of the state of Georgia versus Michael Grant, she began, her voice quivering slightly. We find the defendant. She paused, glancing at the paper before her. The tension in the room was suffocating. Madison held her breath. Not guilty. The words hung in the air for a moment before the room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, and even a few cheers filled the space. Madison banged her gavel, restoring order, though her heart raced beneath her calm exterior. She glanced at Michael, who sat frozen in his chair, his eyes wide with disbelief. Slowly, his shoulders sagged, and his head dropped as if the weight of the world had finally been lifted. Mr. Grant, Madison said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. The jury has spoken. You are free to go. Court is adjourned. The sharp crack of her gavel signaled the end of the trial. But for Madison, the real weight of what had just transpired was only beginning. As the courtroom emptied, Madison lingered, her gaze fixed on Michael. He stood at the defense table, signing his release papers with Dana by his side. For a moment, she thought he might leave without a word, but then he turned and walked toward her bench. The room had all but cleared, save for a few clerks and deputies tidying up. Michael stopped a few feet from her, his expression a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something more complicated. Judge Carter, he said quietly, his voice firm yet restrained. Thank you. Madison hesitated, unsure how to respond. She met his gaze, seeing the boy she had once known and the man he had become. You don't owe me thanks, Michael, she said softly. This wasn't about me. He nodded, his eyes searching hers. Maybe not, but it matters that you were fair. That's not something I've seen a lot of in my life. As he turned to leave, Madison felt the weight of his words settle over her. The justice system had done its job today, but it wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough. She watched Michael walk out of the courtroom and into an uncertain future, knowing this case had changed them both forever. The courthouse steps were bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun as Michael Grant emerged, finally free. A small crowd had gathered, reporters, spectators, even a few local activists, all eager to capture the moment. Cameras flashed and voices called out, but Michael barely seemed to notice. His steps were slow and deliberate, his expression unreadable as he took in the world beyond the courtroom walls. Madison Carter watched from her office window, the weight of the trial still pressing on her chest. The verdict had been clear, but the questions it raised lingered. She had upheld the law, but had she truly delivered justice? She couldn't shake the image of Michael's face as he thanked her, a mixture of gratitude, relief, and a quiet resignation that spoke of battles fought far beyond the confines of her courtroom. Down below, Michael paused at the base of the steps, his attorney Dana Reeves at his side. A reporter thrust a microphone toward him. "Mr. Grant, what are your thoughts on today's verdict? Do you feel justice was served?" Michael's gaze flickered to the reporter, his shoulders tense. For a moment it seemed he might ignore the question, but then he spoke, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "Justice?" He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "This wasn't justice. This was survival. I'm grateful to be free. But this system, it's broken. It's always been broken." Dana placed a hand on his arm, a silent gesture of support. Michael glanced at her, then back at the crowd. "I didn't do what they accused me of," he continued. "But I've lived my whole life under suspicion, under judgment. Today's verdict doesn't erase that." The crowd fell silent, his words hanging in the air. Madison turned away from the window, her chest tightening. He was right. The trial had exposed cracks in the system she had dedicated her life to upholding, and she couldn't ignore them any longer. Later that evening, as the courthouse emptied and the night settled in, Madison found herself walking the quiet halls, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. She paused outside the courtroom, staring at the bench where she had presided over Michael's trial. It felt different now, smaller somehow, as if the weight of what had transpired had stripped it of its authority. A knock on the door broke her reverie. She turned to see Dana standing there, her expression cautious but determined. "Judge Carter," she began, stepping inside, "I wanted to thank you for how you handled the case." Madison nodded, her voice quiet. "I just did my job." Dana hesitated. "You did more than that. You listened. Not everyone does." After Dana left, Madison stood alone in the darkened room. The day's events replayed in her mind, each detail sharpening her resolve. Michael had walked out of her courtroom a free man, but his words stayed with her. If the system was broken, it was her duty to help fix it. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of something she hadn't realized she'd lost: purpose. Weeks after the trial, Madison Carter sat in her modest home office, staring at a blank notepad. Michael Grant's words echoed in her mind. "The system's broken. It's always been broken." She had heard similar sentiments before, but this time, it felt personal. She hadn't just seen the cracks in the system, she'd watched a man she once cared for nearly be swallowed by them. Taking a deep breath, Madison began jotting down ideas. She wrote about systemic bias, flawed evidence, and the weight of assumptions. Each word was a step toward something bigger, a plan to address the inequities she had witnessed firsthand. She couldn't change the past, but she could use her position to push for reform.